The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. Imagine being locked in a tiny cell, no bigger than a bathroom stall, for 23 hours a day. No human contact, no sunlight, no escape, just silence and your own thoughts echoing back at you. This isn't a nightmare. It's reality for thousands of inmates in solitary confinement across the world. Today, we're peeling back the walls of one of the most controversial practices in modern prisons. We'll explore the psychological horror, the documented cases of trauma, and the shocking consequences that leave men broken for life. Stay with us, because what you're about to see will challenge everything you've thought about justice, punishment, and the human mind. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The cell that breaks minds. The moment the heavy steel door clanged shut behind him, John Harris knew something had changed. He had been in and out of jails before, but nothing prepared him for this. A space so small it could barely fit his body, walls so bare it seemed reality itself had been stripped away, and silence so complete it made him hyper-aware of every heartbeat, every breath. This was solitary confinement, and for the next 23 hours, he would face the most relentless interrogation of his own mind. Across the United States, in facilities from New York to California, tens of thousands of inmates experience this daily. Known officially as administrative segregation, solitary confinement is described by authorities as a necessary tool to maintain order and safety. But for those inside, it is an experience that fractures identity, perception, and sanity. Psychologists refer to the resulting condition as SHU Syndrome, a term coined from security housing units where prolonged isolation drives inmates toward paranoia, anxiety, hallucinations, and in extreme cases, cognitive collapse. John had been a low-level gang affiliate, tattooed across his arms and neck, the ink telling stories of loyalty and violence. But here, the symbols of his past identity meant nothing. The prison system had stripped him to a number, a cell, a name on a log. His first hours were almost bearable. He paced, tried to read, and even scribbled notes, but by the third hour, the reality of the silence began to suffocate him. Time slowed. Each passing minute stretched into an eternity. Experts say the effects are cumulative. Dr. Craig Haney, a renowned psychologist, explains that human brains are wired for interaction, stimulation, and social context. Deprive someone of these essential needs, and the mind begins to create its own reality. Hallucinations start small, shadows that seem alive, whispers in empty corners, but they grow, feeding fear and distrust. For John, the first signs were subtle. The walls seemed to pulse. The tiny window of light from the high slot in the cell cast moving shadows, which he swore were figures watching him. His own breathing echoed back like someone else's. This horror isn't isolated. The infamous Angola Three, Albert Woodfuchs, Herman Wallace, and Robert King, spent decades in solitary confinement in Louisiana State Penitentiary. Woodfuchs and Wallace endured over 40 years locked away, sometimes in cells no larger than John's. Reports from that case describe deep psychological trauma, memory loss, hallucinations, and an almost complete disconnection from the outside world. Wallace, in particular, wrote letters describing the walls closing in, the silence screaming, and his mind splitting like ice under heat. Their experience became an international symbol of the cruelty of long-term isolation. Even short-term solitary can be devastating. Consider Adam Bryant, an inmate in the U.S. who died after weeks in isolation. Guards reported he was unresponsive and withdrawn. Medical evaluations later concluded that his mental state had deteriorated rapidly due to sensory deprivation and extreme anxiety. These are not anomalies. They are documented consequences that echo across prisons in the United States, Canada, and Europe. In John's cell, the first night was the worst. The darkness seemed to move, shifting shapes in his peripheral vision. He heard scratching at the walls, whispering that could have been nothing, or could have been his mind. Sleep became impossible. Every sound in the corridor, the faint clanging of metal, the distant footstep of a guard, sent a jolt through him. His body craved human touch, conversation, even the faintest acknowledgement, but the only interaction was the sliding of a metal tray under the door. Psychologists note that inmates in solitary often undergo time distortion. Hours stretch into days, days into weeks. John began counting in his head, trying to track the passage of time, but numbers lost meaning. Minutes felt like hours, and the monotony gnawed at him. He would speak to himself to fill the void, repeating words until they seemed foreign, alien, even threatening. His tattoos, once badges of pride, became marks of confinement, a history that no longer mattered, a past life that felt unreal. Despite the horror, John knew he had to survive. Survival strategies varied. Some paced, some exercised in place, others wrote endlessly. John started carving small notes into the metal bed frame, tiny reminders that he existed, that time was passing, that he had a purpose beyond this cell. He found solace in the routine of the prison clock, even if distorted. Food slots became his only touchpoint with reality, each meal a brief signal that the outside world still existed. But solitude has a dark mirror. Without social checks, paranoia blooms. Every noise, every shadow, every clanging door became a threat. Guards were not just authority figures. They were potential adversaries, even when they were simply delivering meals. Fellow inmates were invisible ghosts, yet somehow omnipresent in his mind, as John imagined conversations and conflicts that never happened. Researchers call this social hallucination, a survival mechanism of the mind under extreme deprivation. The irony of solitary confinement is that it's meant to manage dangerous behavior, yet can create instability and aggression. Many inmates released from isolation act unpredictably, struggle to reintegrate, and in some tragic cases, attempt suicide. It is a system designed to contain danger, but often produces psychological danger instead. By the end of his first week, John's sense of self had begun to warp. He couldn't remember simple sequences, couldn't track thoughts linearly, and he often mistook memory for hallucination. His identity as John Harris, the gang member, the father, the son, began to blur. He was reduced to awareness of the walls, the door, the air, and the unbearable quiet. The mind unravels. The first days in solitary confinement are disorienting. But after a week, or sometimes even just a few days, the human mind begins to unravel in ways most cannot imagine. For John Harris, the silence became more than empty space. It became a living entity, whispering threats and fears into his thoughts. Shadows crawled across the walls, and the faint echoes of distant footsteps seemed like a chorus of unseen eyes watching his every move. Psychologists studying solitary confinement consistently describe a cascade of cognitive deterioration that can occur after mere weeks of isolation. Anxiety becomes constant. Sleep is fractured. Hallucinations appear not as fleeting illusions, but as tangible intrusions into reality. In John's case, he began seeing movement in corners that didn't exist, hearing voices calling his name, and sensing threats in the air. The human mind craves interaction, and when denied, it fabricates contact, even hostile contact, to fill the void. Historically, these effects have been observed and documented extensively. Consider the notorious case of Albert Woodfuchs at Angola prison. Decades in isolation drove him to near-total sensory detachment. Letters and interviews reveal a man who, despite remarkable resilience, faced a daily battle with his own mind. He reported hearing doors slam when none had, and feeling hands brush past him in empty corridors. For John, the first hallucinations were subtle, shadows stretching unnaturally, fleeting sounds in the ventilation system, but they escalated rapidly. The monotony of the environment accelerates this deterioration. Solitary cells are stripped of stimuli. No television, no visitors, no radio, no social interaction. Time becomes meaningless. Guards appear as brief intrusions rather than humans, slipping trays of food under a locked door. Meals, meant to nourish the body, become reminders of the cage itself, each clatter and scrape magnified by the oppressive silence. John's tattoos, gang symbols inked across his forearms and shoulders, were a source of pride outside, but here they serve as a tether to a past that seemed increasingly unreal. In the quiet, he traced the lines with his fingers, remembering loyalty, fear, and survival on the streets. These memories became double-edged. Comfort one moment, torment the next. Isolation magnifies regrets and past trauma, transforming the mind into a prison within a prison. SHU Syndrome, or Security Housing Unit Syndrome, has been clinically observed to produce symptoms like paranoia, hypervigilance, and extreme anxiety. John's behavior shifted subtly at first. He stopped pacing and began sitting rigidly on the metal bunk, scanning the tiny cell as if a threat lurked behind every shadow. Sounds outside became potential dangers. The distant clanging of metal bars was no longer just routine. It became a herald of unseen menace. Guards delivering meals were not simply doing their jobs. In his mind, they were agents of punishment, judgment, and constant observation. This mental unraveling has deadly consequences. In the U.S., Adam Bryant's death after only weeks of solitary confinement shocked the nation. Reports indicated he had become increasingly paranoid, withdrawn, and hallucinated incessantly before collapsing. Experts emphasize that even relatively short periods of isolation can precipitate severe psychological damage, especially in inmates with prior mental health vulnerabilities. In Canada and Europe, courts have started acknowledging this reality. In 2025, a UK court ruled that prolonged isolation of a prisoner at HMP Woodhill violated human rights, citing severe PTSD, paranoia, and cognitive disruption. John's nights were the hardest. Darkness in a solitary cell is not merely absence of light. It becomes an active participant in psychological torment. Without external cues to anchor the mind, he experienced temporal disorientation. He could no longer differentiate night from day. Hours bled into one another. Shadows seemed to shift on their own. He spoke to himself, sometimes arguing, sometimes pleading, trying to convince his mind that he was still anchored in reality. Inmates often develop coping mechanisms under these conditions. John began writing obsessive notes, scratching them into the metal frame of the bed and tracing patterns on the walls. It was a desperate attempt to assert control over the uncontrollable. But even these routines were fragile. Minor disturbances, a sudden guard's step, a gust of wind rattling the cell, could trigger intense episodes of panic. Studies indicate that prolonged isolation can permanently alter brain chemistry, heightening stress responses and leaving lasting psychological scars. Isolation also breeds self-reflection, but of the darkest kind. In solitary confinement, inmates confront the rawest parts of themselves, stripped of distraction or social validation. For John, memories of past violence, betrayals, and mistakes surfaced relentlessly. His tattoos became flashpoints for memory, each symbol tied to acts he both glorified and regretted. The mind, deprived of external stimuli, clings to internal narratives, replaying events with heightened emotional intensity. Human rights organizations argue that solitary confinement is not just punitive, it is torturous. The UN's Mandela Rules explicitly state that solitary exceeding 15 days can constitute cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Yet in facilities across the US, Canada, and Europe, it is common for inmates to spend weeks, months, or even years in near-total isolation. The Angola 3 exemplify the extremes of this practice, while modern cases like John's demonstrate how even short-term isolation can wreak havoc on mental health. By the second week, John's mind had created a new reality inside the cell. Sounds outside became messages. Shadows became shapes of people or animals, sometimes threatening, sometimes familiar. Hallucinations blurred with memories. He was simultaneously alert and detached, constantly scanning, constantly fearful, yet trapped in a cycle of imagined and real experiences. Sleep was rare and fragmented, leaving him exhausted yet hypervigilant. Edge of sanity. By the third week in solitary confinement, John Harris's reality had begun to fracture. The cell, once merely oppressive, had become a labyrinth in his mind, a space where every shadow carried intent, every sound was amplified, and every passing guard was both enemy and savior. This is the point at which many inmates begin teetering on the edge of sanity, where the psychological cost of isolation becomes undeniable. In facilities across the United States, Canada, and Europe, experts have documented a chilling array of symptoms. Anxiety transforms into panic attacks. Hallucinations become vivid and sustained. Inmates may perceive conversations in empty corridors, see figures standing silently in corners, or hear whispers calling their names in the dead of night. John's experience mirrored these phenomena. One night, he swore he saw a figure kneeling beside his bunk, only to realize hours later it was the interplay of light and shadow from the small window above the cell. Yet the fear was real. Every clenching of his stomach, every shiver down his spine, reinforced the illusion of threat. Long-term isolation often forces the mind to invent social interaction. Psychologists refer to this as internalized social hallucination, where the brain creates voices, companions, or antagonists to maintain some semblance of social structure. For John, this manifested as imagined confrontations, mock arguments with imaginary inmates over territory, loyalty, or betrayal. These hallucinations were terrifyingly real to him, causing adrenaline surges and physiological stress akin to actual conflict. His gangster tattoos, once symbols of power and belonging, became reminders of a world now unreachable. The real danger of solitary, however, lies in its cumulative effect. Sleep deprivation, constant hyperawareness, and sensory monotony compound psychological trauma. Research shows that even after release, former inmates struggle with memory, attention, and emotional regulation. Cases like Albert Woodfick's illustrate the extreme. Decades of isolation eroded his cognitive functions, leaving lasting scars despite eventual freedom. For John, weeks of solitary had already begun to erode his ability to distinguish reality from hallucination, leaving him anxious, disoriented, and deeply fearful of the outside world. In addition to hallucinations, paranoia becomes a near-constant companion. Every footstep outside his cell was interpreted as an approaching threat. A guard's glance, brief and neutral, felt like judgment. In some cases, inmates report believing that guards or fellow prisoners are communicating about them through subtle gestures or coded sounds. For John, the paranoia was relentless. He imagined that guards were plotting against him, that cameras were watching every movement, and that even the walls themselves had eyes. The mind, deprived of normal social cues, defaults to vigilance, and the small cell transforms into a cage of constant perceived danger. Some inmates attempt coping strategies, but the solitude is a cruel adversary. John paced, exercised in place, and even sang quietly to himself, but these measures offered only temporary relief. The small window high on the wall was his only glimpse of daylight, yet even this became distorted. Shadows moved differently than reality dictated, sunlight seemed harsher, and he felt trapped in a world that no longer obeyed natural rules. This mental disintegration is not abstract. There are documented consequences. Consider Adam Bryant, the American inmate who died after only weeks in isolation. Medical reports and autopsies confirm that extreme sensory deprivation, psychological stress, and pre-existing mental health conditions contributed to a rapid decline that led to death. His story, widely reported in U.S. media, served as a grim warning. Solitary is not merely uncomfortable. It can be lethal. Even in Europe, where courts have started imposing limits on isolation, extreme cases reveal similar dangers. In the UK, a prisoner held for prolonged isolation at HMP Woodhill developed severe PTSD, paranoia, and dissociation. The court ruled that the conditions violated human rights, citing the extreme psychological impact of extended solitary confinement. For John, these international precedents offered little comfort. He was trapped in a cage that his mind had transformed into an arena of constant terror. By the third week, John began experiencing physical manifestations of psychological strain. His heart raced without provocation, palms sweated, and his stomach ached with persistent tension. Sleep was increasingly rare. When it came, it was broken by vivid dreams or nightmares that blended with reality. He would wake convinced that shadows were still moving, that voices persisted, that the cell had become a living entity. Experts warn that prolonged solitary can trigger long-lasting endocrine and neurological changes, leaving permanent anxiety, depression, and even aggression. Gang tattoos, symbols of identity and power outside, took on new meaning within the cell. They were maps of a past life, a reminder of relationships, loyalties, and rivalries that could no longer protect him. John traced the ink with his fingers, remembering confrontations and friendships. Yet these memories became distorted. In isolation, recollection is a double-edged sword, comforting yet torturous, anchoring yet highlighting absence. Social reintegration, after even weeks in isolation, can be traumatic. Inmates like John often emerge hypervigilant, distrustful, and socially awkward. Skills needed for everyday interaction, conversation, emotional regulation, and shared activities atrophy. SHU Syndrome manifests not only during confinement, but long afterward, leaving individuals struggling to reclaim their identity and humanity. Throughout these experiences, the prison environment itself is relentless. Metal doors clanging, the distant murmur of other inmates, and the occasional echoing footstep become triggers. Guards, though often neutral, are perceived as potential adversaries. Every sensory cue becomes magnified. The brain, deprived of normal social and environmental input, turns ordinary signals into threats, further destabilizing the psyche. John's survival depended on creating order within the chaos. He kept meticulous mental records of time, traced patterns on the walls, and rehearsed conversations in his head to maintain some sense of social competence. But even these strategies were fragile. The slightest disruption, a sudden noise, a shifting shadow, or the distant clank of a metal door, could trigger a spiral into panic and hallucination. The breaking point. By the fourth week, John Harris was no longer just isolated. He was unraveling. His thoughts had become a tangle of fear, regret, and hallucination. The walls of his solitary cell, small and unchanging, had grown into living entities in his mind. Shadows twisted into faces. Fleeting noises became conversations, and the clanging of distant doors morphed into sinister messages. At this point, many inmates reach what psychologists call the breaking point, where the mind teeters on the edge of permanent trauma or even death. Solitary confinement is not just an abstract punishment. In real life, it has led to severe injury and fatalities. Adam Bryant's case remains a chilling reminder. After only weeks in isolation, his mental state collapsed. He withdrew from food, stopped speaking, and ultimately died, alone in a cell. His death forced prison systems across the U.S. to confront the lethal consequences of prolonged isolation. Yet incidents like these continue to occur. John felt the same crushing weight of despair. Days blurred, reality distorted, and each minute felt like a lifetime. Prison staff are trained to maintain order, not mental wellness. Guards are often unaware or unprepared for the depth of psychological damage occurring behind steel doors. For John, interactions were brief, mechanical, and alienating. Trays slid under the door. Guards glanced in and moved on. Any attempt to communicate was met with procedural monotony, rather than understanding or intervention. This lack of human contact, coupled with the oppressive environment, drives many inmates to desperation. The physical space of solitary itself amplifies the danger. John's cell, no larger than a bathroom stall, contained only a metal bunk, a toilet, and a small sink. Minimal light entered from a high slit, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. Without natural cues, sleep became erratic, appetite declined, and physical health deteriorated. The body and mind are intrinsically linked. In solitary, the decline of one accelerates the decline of the other. One of the most harrowing aspects of isolation is how it preys on pre-existing vulnerabilities. John had no prior diagnosed mental health condition, yet the extreme deprivation quickly triggered anxiety, panic, and hypervigilance. Inmates with pre-existing PTSD, depression, or cognitive disorders are particularly at risk. Research indicates that solitary can exacerbate these conditions to a near-fatal degree. In some documented cases, the mental torment becomes so unbearable that inmates attempt suicide or self-harm, a tragic outcome of a system meant to maintain control. The psychological trauma is compounded by uncertainty. Solitary is unpredictable. Inmates never know when they will be released, how long confinement will last, or whether they will face punishment for minor infractions. John's sense of time had completely deteriorated. Days and nights blended. He lost track of meals, exercise, and visits. Even the rhythmic clanging of doors in the corridor became meaningless. This uncertainty is deliberate in some cases. Prison authorities believe unpredictability enforces compliance, but the human cost is catastrophic. Cases like the Angola 3 illustrate extremes. Herman Wallace and Albert Woodfuchs spent decades in solitary, sometimes locked away for more than 23 hours a day. Both suffered severe psychological trauma, hallucinations, and paranoia. Yet, their stories also highlight resilience. Despite unimaginable conditions, they maintained an identity, communicated through letters and gestures, and eventually won their freedom. For John, however, even short-term isolation was enough to bring him to the edge of his mental endurance. The breaking point often manifests in desperation. In solitary, inmates may lash out at themselves, the cell, or even imagine threats. John found himself banging his fists against the metal walls, whispering angrily at the shadows, and questioning the reality of his own existence. Sleep deprivation intensified the delusions. Sounds of distant voices grew louder, almost conversing with him, sometimes mocking, sometimes warning. Every mental or physical stimulus became magnified, creating a cycle of escalating fear and confusion. Legally, there are some safeguards. The UK court ruling against HMP Woodhill acknowledged that prolonged isolation violated human rights. The Mandela Rules, adopted by the UN, declare that solitary confinement beyond 15 days constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Yet, in practice, violations are widespread. Inmates in the United States, Canada, and parts of Europe continue to experience prolonged isolation with little oversight. John's suffering is not unique, it is systemic. Despite the horror, some inmates find small ways to survive. Mental exercises, meditation, or keeping a mental journal become lifelines. John traced patterns on the walls, repeated prayers silently, and mentally rehearsed conversations he hoped to have outside. These strategies, though fragile, helped him maintain a thread of identity amid the relentless psychological assault. Researchers suggest that even minor cognitive engagement can reduce the severity of isolation-induced psychosis. Still, the danger remains real and constant. SHU Syndrome is not hypothetical. It is a documented outcome of extreme confinement. Symptoms include anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, emotional dysregulation, and cognitive impairment. John experienced them all. He misinterpreted shadows as threats, hallucinated voices, and struggled to recall past events accurately. He was simultaneously alert and disoriented, engaged with reality yet trapped in his mind's distorted version of it. By the end of week 4, John's breaking point was unmistakable. The cell had become both enemy and mirror, reflecting fears, regrets, and fragmented identity back at him. The human mind, isolated and deprived, is capable of extraordinary resilience, but also extraordinary fragility. Survival in solitary is not about comfort or adaptation. It is a fight to retain a shred of self amid systematic erasure. Surviving the silence, recovery, and reflection. Weeks had passed, or maybe months. John Harris could no longer tell. Solitary confinement had tested every fiber of his mind, body, and spirit. Yet, in the midst of relentless fear, hallucination, and despair, a small spark of resilience remained. Human beings are astonishingly adaptive, and even in the cruelest conditions, the mind clings to fragments of hope. For John, survival became an exercise in reclaiming identity, piece by piece, thought by thought. Recovery from solitary is not instantaneous. Psychologists note that inmates often require months or even years to regain a sense of reality, rebuild social connections, and restore mental equilibrium. John began with small steps, focusing on the physical sensations of his body, tracing the lines of his tattoos as reminders of his history and resilience, and rehearsing conversations he hoped to have with the outside world. Each microaction became a lifeline in a world deliberately designed to erase the self. Cases like the Angola 3 demonstrate both the horrors and the potential for resilience. Albert Woodfix and Herman Wallace endured decades in isolation, yet they survived, found purpose in activism, and eventually gained freedom. Their stories, widely reported internationally, illustrate that while solitary confinement can inflict profound trauma, the human spirit is capable of enduring even the darkest extremes. For John, these examples became mental anchors, evidence that his struggle could one day lead to life beyond the cell. Legal challenges and human rights advocacy are critical in addressing the systemic failures of solitary confinement. In the UK, courts ruled that prolonged isolation violated prisoners' human rights, acknowledging the severe psychological damage caused by extended solitary. Activists argue that similar reforms are urgently needed across the US, Canada, and Europe, where lengthy periods of isolation continue to jeopardize mental health. John's experience is emblematic of a global issue. Solitary is not rehabilitation. It is punishment, often cruel and unnecessary. In recovery, the process is as psychological as it is social. John found himself initially distrustful of others, hypervigilant to every sound, and hesitant to engage. Interactions that most take for granted, small talk, shared meals, group activities, were once terrifying, now gradually restoring a sense of normalcy. He learned to navigate spaces without perceiving constant threat, to distinguish hallucinations from reality, and to trust his own judgment again. These incremental victories, while invisible to the outside world, were monumental steps toward reclaiming autonomy. For viewers in the United States, Canada, Europe, and beyond, John's story is not just a tale of suffering. It is a call to awareness. Solitary confinement, especially when prolonged beyond a few days, is a practice with documented psychological and physical consequences. SHU Syndrome, hallucinations, paranoia, and cognitive deterioration are not abstract theories. They are real, lived experiences of thousands of inmates worldwide. Awareness and advocacy are key to systemic change. But there's more than despair here. There is hope. Awareness of the psychological impact of solitary confinement is growing. Human rights organizations, legal reforms, and media coverage are bringing attention to these practices. Courts, as in the UK, are beginning to intervene. Stories like John's, Woodfix's, and Bryant's illuminate the urgency. Society cannot continue to inflict extreme isolation on vulnerable minds without consequence. As John eventually stepped out of solitary, the first moments of freedom were overwhelming. Light seemed brighter, sound sharper, and the air sweeter than he remembered. But the journey of recovery had only begun. Counseling, social interaction, and the slow reconstruction of his identity became essential. Every small interaction, conversation with another inmate, a guard's neutral acknowledgement, a letter from family, was a lifeline back to humanity. His tattoos, once merely symbols of gang affiliation, now serve as markers of survival, resilience, and the history of endurance. Each one told a story of both past violence and present survival. As he reflected, John realized that solitary had not broken him completely, but it had left scars, invisible yet indelible, shaping his understanding of justice, punishment, and human fragility. Solitary confinement is more than a punishment. It is a psychological battlefield where time, silence, and isolation wage war on the mind. John Harris's journey is just one story among thousands, a story of despair, resilience, and the fight to reclaim humanity. If this documentary moved you, enlightened you, or even shocked you, it's time to take action. Like this video, comment your thoughts, and share it with friends to spread awareness. Subscribe to our channel to dive deeper into the hidden realities of prisons, true crime, and stories that challenge our understanding of justice. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that could change the way you see the world. Together, we can shine a light on the darkest corners of incarceration.